So who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, so my name is Scott Young. I'm an author. I've written two books about learning, Ultralearning, and my new book, Get Better at Anything. I'm also a writer. I have a blog that I've been writing for almost 2 decades now, where I've written thousands of articles on self-improvement, personal productivity, learning, education, and all these kinds of topics.
So we're going to get into the whole mix of it because I
Yeah.
find this topic fascinating. When Ultra Learning came out, we actually had a conversation for 6 Pixels, which
Hmm.
is great. So I was thrilled to see that you reached back out to me. You're like, new book, let's chat.
Yeah.
And it's something that you actually tease out in some of the marketing for this
Hmm.
book. But I was thinking about it all the time as I was going through getting better at anything, which is this idea that learning really is mysterious. And it's kind of dumbfounding
Yeah.
when you think
Yeah.
about it, because the vast majority of us will go into school at nursery, even
Yeah.
kindergarten, even some daycares are essentially schools at this point, priming
Yeah.
kids for this. We spend the vast majority of our days there, from young people to
Hmm.
adults. Many of us, I don't think, stop learning or want to continue
Hmm.
learning. And yet you're right. It is such a mysterious thing of, am I doing it right? Am I good at
Yeah.
this? Am I benefiting from this? Does this make sense? Even when you're ingesting the information, that feeling of, I feel like I can take what I've learned and now do something with it, or even teach it to someone else.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we hit the nail on the head with this book, but I'd love to toss around
Yeah.
this idea of why. Why would this be something so mysterious when we've systematized it so dramatically?
Well, I mean, so part of it, I think, is just that this is a real gap in our education, that we cover a lot of specific content areas. We've all taken music classes and probably some art classes and history classes and gym classes, but there was never like the learning class where someone actually like sits us down and says, this is how learning works. And I mean, this isn't that you can't learn without this class, but I think just the same way that if you were wanting to be, an elite athlete, or you were wanting to be excellent at your job, having someone sit you down and be like, this is how this job works would probably be helpful. And so I think it's sort of an unfortunate kind of quirk, maybe because a lot of the learning sciences are relatively new, and so much of our traditional education is kind of classical and backwards looking. So everyone has their vested interests in teaching the things that have always been taught, and so new subjects get overlooked. And maybe also because, again, I think that curiosity is one of those things where if you don't know much about it, it's not like you are curious about it. You don't have this sort of like, oh, I really want to know about this because I know nothing about it. It's only once you start to peel under the hood that you actually start to ask these questions, like, how do we learn things? How do we get better at stuff? Like, how important are the different sort of things that go into learning, like practice and books and feedback and all that kind of stuff. And so for me, writing this book was a real joy, because I feel like the world really belongs to the people that are willing to peel one layer below the surface, who are able to like look at it a little bit more in depth, because I think there's a lot of ways that we can do things better. And so that's sort of the message of the book. And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to try to help people with is, remove at least some of the mystery. Not that we're going to ever remove all the mystery of what it is to be a human being, but remove a little bit of the mystery so that we can make better informed decisions about how we're learning, whether it's in school or work or just for fun.
Look, you're spending a lot of time on this, as I do as well.
Yeah.
There's a tweet that is often, or an X post now we say, that's often
Yeah. Yeah.
floated around, this line of, I didn't let school get in the way of my education. It's attributed
Yeah.
to me,
Yeah.
but it wasn't me. But it's constantly, I see it all the
Yeah.
time. I never repost it, but I always see that. And it is true of how I live my life. So
Is that
I
a Mark
probably,
Twain quote? I feel like it's a
yeah.
Twain, like I never let,
I mean,
yeah.
look, Scott, it's so easy
Yeah.
to
I'll have
confuse
to
my
look.
work with Mark Twain's. I mean,
Yes.
we know that, we've
Yeah.
known each other long enough that just
You're
this brilliance
both classic
oozes.
American
Yes.
humorists. Yeah.
Who's to say if it was Mark Twain or
Yeah.
if
The
it was
Canadian
somebody?
Mark Twain. Right?
Yeah.
Joel over here.
But there is something very fascinating about
Yeah.
the result of learning that we all know
Hmm.
we benefit from. We benefit from it financially. We benefit from it from however we define success. We know that it is an accelerant to a better life, whatever the
Hmm.
definition might be for yourself. But in this, you're studying this, and I still can't help not reflect on the fact that we have pedagogy that is dictated by usually your local government of what you're going to
Yeah.
learn, what you're not going to learn. It is systematized in a way in which many people have been very provocative about how we change, how we disrupt
Yeah.
education. We've seen that over the years. And on the other side, we do see a lot of technology changing the way
Hmm.
we learn and how we learn. But there does seem to be this component of it where, my real net feeling when I was reading your book was the bar is so low to be great. Meaning you could take
Yeah.
a course here and there. You could apply yourself to something you're finding interesting. And the bar is really low. Like it's really not
Hmm.
that hard to understand it, really benefit from it, be able to
Hmm.
to have an output from it. There's something so weird in there between governments controlling education to how we
Yeah.
perceive it to technology. It's strange to me that it hasn't progressed at the speed of which other things have.
Yeah, I mean, the field of education as a whole is kind of interesting. There's this cognitive psychologist Carl Berater, and he has this sort of comment that he's been in the field for decades, and he says observers of sort of like educational research and educational practice note that it's like not really like other fields. Like it's not like biology, where you have steady advances of new inventions in technology. It seems like there's all these circular arguments. Like we're sort of still having the same debates that were had 100 years ago about how we should teach and do things. I tend to think the problem is that sometimes you can define yourself into a little box, like where this is what you have to do, and then you get kind of stuck because it is hard to move past that. Now, I don't want to say there's no innovations. I think that we've learned an incredible amount in the last 100 years, but in terms of how that knowledge is actually applied, I think it has been maybe somewhat disappointing that we're not at the level where like some of the insights that have been gained from the cognitive sciences, neuroscience, a lot of these things have not yet really like integrated or solidified into like, oh well, this is a better way of teaching than what would have been done 100 years ago, or a better way of learning or studying. So I think that the ideas that I want to kind of put forth in this book are really for people who want to think outside the system. They want to improve themselves. They want to help the people around them learn better. And I don't know, I kind of feel like starting with Ultralearning, this has been sort of my vision, is not, sometimes when I was writing that book, people would be like, well, how can we like reform all schools? And I
Yeah.
just think it's an impossible task because you have so many people of competing visions of what education should be for, what it should do. And like this kind of, political gridlock means that it's really hard to do anything that's kind of unusual or really challenges the status quo. But that doesn't mean that we can't do these things for ourselves. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to approach your self-education differently, to approach the things that you're interested in differently. And so I write these books kind of for that audience because I feel like, yeah, if you're asking me, okay, can we like totally transform education? I mean, you look at the college lecture, for instance, like how the college classroom works. These institutions, they're like incredibly traditional. Like they have basically not really changed much in 100 years, even though, there's pretty good evidence that, sitting in a classroom where someone talks at you for an hour is not like the best way to learn things. It's not like we just happen to get that right off the bat. It's just, well, that's easier. And that's the format that everyone understands. And so I do think there is opportunity for improving how we learn if you're willing to sort of take the initiative in it.
The self-learning aspect, which is the
Mm-hmm.
crux of your work for sure, it comes to people at very different moments in time. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we could look at this book and go, there might be a small market in some kids who might be in
Yeah.
elementary school, maybe high school, maybe
Yeah.
college. But I believe the real market here is people who have finished formal education, who are
Yeah.
now working, they're trying to upskill, they're trying to see where the opportunities lie. And this idea of what education looks like there, it's fascinating to me that you're fascinated with this. I'm a little bit curious about where did that come from? Because a lot of the
Yeah.
result of this work tends to be in the space of life hacking and productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we would include this in
Yeah.
those arenas, but you're going in a bit of a different direction from that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think that there is a kind of a point that, and maybe some people don't encounter it, but I feel there's a point in most people's lives where you realize that you can learn things and that you have this sort of, shall we say, like autonomy to go out and learn things that you're interested in. And for some people, I think maybe it comes in high school where they realize this. For some people, it's after college. And indeed, there's probably some people that they just kind of, they never really get into it. Like they just sort of find the thing that they were taught early on and they're
Ride
good
the
at, and they
wave.
just keep
Yeah.
doing it, and so I think that sort of moment of discovery of like, oh, I want to learn, it could be some new skill, like for the workplace, I want to learn, accounting, programming, finance, something like that. Or it could be like a new sport, or it could be some hobby. I really do think the world belongs to people who have this sort of self-directed tendency. I mean, I don't remember who said it, but there was some sort of comment that like the system is not your friend. Like basically the kind of systems that have been created around you. So like the educational system, the workplace system, all these things, not that they're actively hostile, but they are not really designed to maximize your own well-being or your own fulfillment of your goals and this kind of thing. And so really we need to be sort of autonomous agents. We have to be going out there and pursuing our own goals and our own interests. So like the purpose of the education system is not to be just sort of like perfectly hand off to you. This is the best possible things for you to know and learn. I mean, it's complicated, like we were talking about, it's this complicated mixture of like, different people's interests of what they want you to learn and what they want you to study and how they want to do it. And, from the people who, the business interests who think you should be learning this in school because it'll be useful for them when they hire you, to the professors that want to opt for a way of teaching that's not going to distract from their
Right.
tenure making research work. Like all these different conflicts of interest mean that like what you end up with when you just go with the default, I think, is rarely like the most optimal system. It's rarely the case that like, oh, well, this has been perfectly designed to make you excel as a student.
There's been ways in which we've figured this out. We're going to talk about them, but for the purpose of the conversation, I want to level set a little bit because the audience might not have heard, although they should listen to the last conversation we had. Because the two things that you did that really rattled my cage, that made me rethink how I think about it, learning and moving forward, was the MIT challenge and the year without English. I know often when I speak about things I did a while ago, I don't like regurgitating stories, but I do think for the spirit of the conversation of where I think you and I would like to go with this, can you walk people through one or both of them, what they mean, and then also what were you thinking? Because a lot of people might just dismiss this as some, if Scott does this, it'll be a great keynote speech and a great little business for him. But I don't think that's why you did this.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so, well, first of all, I think the important thing to point out is what you just said. Like, these are projects that are now, as I go forward, they're like now receding in
Very
time.
in
So
the
I'm talking about
distance.
stuff that, I'm a father of two right now. I'm in my mid 30s. These were things that were done in my early 20s. So, we're talking about like a decade ago for, I think we're now actually 10 years since I finished the language learning project. So I'll talk about the MIT challenge first, because that one happened first. So after I graduated from school, I studied business in college, and I wanted to go back and study computer science, but I didn't really want to get a degree. I already had a degree, and it was just like I didn't really want to go back to school, do undergrad classes with the younger kids and this kind of thing. I just thought I'd like to learn this, but I don't really need the paper, which I think right off the bat, I think that's an important thing to point out, because sometimes people take me as being like a really strong contrarian in that, like, okay, no one should be going to school, you should just be doing this. But I think my situation was also unique, because I think that often happens where you have some educational background, you went to school, but you want to pivot, you want to maybe go into a different career, or you want to take on things that you're kind of not qualified to do. And it's not that you need the credentials, but you do need the education, you do need the learning. And so that was the situation I found myself in. And MIT, very graciously, a bunch of other universities offer the same, but MIT has one of the most extensive, has a library of courses that they teach in their school that they just kind of give material away for free. So for many of these classes, that includes the lecture videos, it includes problem sets with their solution keys, it includes, for computer science, which is the one that I was interested in, it includes even like the programming suite. So you write the little software program and then you run it, and it'll tell you whether it works or not. So basically there's all these resources from MIT's actual computer science undergrad education that a diligent student could make use of. And so I got the idea of like, well, has anyone ever tried to like learn what an MIT student learns in their undergrad without going to MIT? And this sort of evolved in the idea of like, well, what if you only did the final exams? Like, just also to simplify, the material is not perfectly covering every single little aspect of what they upload. It's kind of a little patchy in places. So I thought I'll just start with the final exams, and later that included the programming projects as well. And I thought, well, if you're kind of condensing it in this way, you're kind of eliminating the essays and the presentations, and you can do the classes whenever you want. You can watch the videos at 1.5 times the speed if you want to. I wanted to try to do it in a compressed time frame, so I tried to do the material over a year. So that was the project I called the MIT Challenge. And I completed it after 12 months, and to my own, standards for grading and stuff, I completed all the exams and the programming projects. And so that was the first real project of like, this is a different way of doing things. Now, I mean, the material, the books, all this stuff is kind of in some ways hyper traditional. Like MIT is very much trying to give you the kind of like liberal arts education for science. So there were physics classes, there was biology classes, I did classes in economics. So in some ways it was hyper traditional, but the method of pursuing it was, at least as my understanding, was novel. Like I don't know anybody else who had done it before me at that time. And so that project was successful, and I think it really buoyed my spirits of like, this kind of approach to learning is possible. There's a lot more that we can do than maybe we realize. And so I decided to tackle another project, inspired a little bit by my experiences trying to learn French. I lived in France for a year while I was in university. It was a sort of a study abroad year. I had some experience with that. And I also had some friends like Benny Lewis. I think Manish Sethi was also another person I knew who were doing these kind of like going to a new country for a couple months and learning the language there. And so I decided to do a project with a friend. We called it the Year Without English. We went to Spain, Brazil, China, and South Korea. And the goal was to learn the languages of each of those countries with the sort of method that when we would arrive in the country, to the greatest extent possible, we wouldn't speak in English. So when we landed in Spain, to the greatest extent possible, we were only speaking in Spanish to each other, to anyone we met. And I would say it worked fairly well. I mean, I really think it is, with all these projects, is for you to judge for yourself. But we made these little like kind of mini documentary videos showing our sort of progress in the languages. And while we certainly weren't perfect at the end of 3 months, we were at a level where I think we were able to accomplish a lot of things that the typical person who is maybe learning a language for travel or for general interest would be happy with. Like, we're living our lives in these languages, we're making friends, we're able to like go about and travel and deal with people in our day-to-day lives and interact in ways that I thought were really meaningful and in ways that really went beyond what we'd be able to do if we were just speaking English in these countries. And so that was a fun project. And I've done some other ones since then, portrait drawing, quantum mechanics, started learning my wife's native language, Macedonian. And so these are all projects that became kind of the backbone for my 2019 book, Ultralearning. And I mean, it's just been a passion of mine ever since to really understand how learning works and help other people do it better.
So the word that I circled and come back to when I think about get better at anything in the conversation, you danced in it a little earlier, but I'm going to be more direct with it, is agency. That if you're going to really pursue a life worth living, you have to assume a very high level of agency over yourself. And when you take that as an idea, especially around education, I was starting to get out of the book this feeling of it might be one of the highest senses of being an agent for yourself because we do education from such a young age, so formally, that we do believe that, well, that is behind me. That's the past. So I'll take a little course here. There's something to learn, but not that spirit of why wouldn't I constantly act like my life is constantly in a state of education?
Yeah.
Now, there's something there also, I think, psychologically about if you say or do that, perhaps your assumption might be that it would be hard to then present in a way in which you are then taken as the boss or seriously or as a way in which someone might think that, oh, this person knows something that I want to take from. But there's something in there that I was really grappling with.
You're
like
hitting
a freedom.
on a point. Yeah, you're hitting on a point that I think is worth stressing, which is that there is this tension between projecting competence, expertise, confidence, and being in a learning mindset. Because, to use the language learning example, I think the major hurdle for people in doing this is not learning the words or the grammar, any of the intellectual difficulty of language learning. Although there is quite a bit of that. I don't want to say it's nothing. But the major thing that people struggle with is that you as an adult are used to projecting a certain amount of linguistic competency in your day-to-day affairs. That when you talk to people, you sound intelligent and articulate, and that matters a lot to you. And so when you talk to people and you make frequent mistakes and you sound less intelligent and you sound less articulate and you're making errors that like are the you make sort of amusing errors where you make jokes that are like you say the wrong word and
it might be inappropriate type of thing.
Yeah. Like I know a lot of non-native English speakers really struggle with the I and E distinction. So beach becomes, and sheet becomes, so it's those kinds of distinctions that like, if you're making those mistakes, it's embarrassing. And I think to really go past that, you have to really embrace this. Well, yeah, but I am going to sound like this. I am going to be incompetent and perceived as less competent. And so I don't think it needs to necessarily project you in a bad light, but I do think as adults, we build these little sort of defensive walls around ourselves where we want to project ourselves as being important and successful and competent and sometimes to a kind of like a little bit too much of a degree. Like we're trying to show ourselves as being these kind of, perfect little people. And that does get in the way of our learning because it means that we can't go out and make mistakes. We can't do things that are foolish. We can't do things that are like, oh, wow, I'm really bad at this, but I'm still doing it. And so I think that's one of the areas where it's an emotional problem. It's a kind of social issue rather than an intellectual difficulty with learning. And certainly, like in the workplace, there is a real we get our rewards, we get our kind of praise for doing the things that we're good at, and that can be great. There's nothing wrong with having a specialty and being excellent at your craft, but it can be restrictive. It can be the case that, well, I don't really want to do this thing anymore, or I don't want to be in this box that I've been in for 10, 20 years, but I'm stuck in that box because if I do anything else, I might fall on my face or I might embarrass myself. So, I mean, and I'm talking about this in the abstract and everyone's going to agree with me, but when you're actually in the situation, it's hard. So I think that the strategies for how you can conceive of projects that sort of deal with this reality are very important.
That tension, I think, is so present in our everyday life. And the framework I talk about it in is artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
The tension that you're talking about is very real because the vast majority of people that are probably listening to this would be knowledge workers.
Yeah.
And AI loves taking very repetitive tasks and eating it for breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of us have these accelerated degrees and work in a place where the work that I do is very specific and smart. And I replicate that for different clients or customers, not realizing that that work is actually something AI does really, really well. So it's interesting
or
too.
Will do well soon. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, the truth with that, from my perspective is it doesn't matter where you sit in the spectrum, if it's going to kill us all or it's going to change the world forever. I still believe it's immediately super impressive and immediately better than most people. It really is. It's quite amazing. And I do a lot of work with this stuff. And I do think that the inner struggle with it's almost as if we can't say it. I can say it because I'm an outsider, but an individual would never say, well, I'm really scared of the fact that it's going to take all of this experience and all this knowledge I have and be able to do it pretty competently, really well.
Yeah.
This also changes the paradigm. Like this is sitting on the cusp of changing everything we think about all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know exactly how things are going to go forward. I feel like if you look at AI specifically, and you look at like what were people's predictions, projections, like you go back in time, even though people who weren't making, formalizable, you can say that they're right or wrong predictions, but just general punditry. I think there's been a very bad track record there that I would say that if you look at the entire history, like really starting in the 1950s of artificial intelligence projections into the future, it seems that we as human beings are really bad at predicting what will fall next, like what will be easy to do and what will be hard to do. Because even now, I would say that like ChatGPT, for instance, or these sort of new technologies that are coming out, they do a lot of things really impressively well, and there's lots of things that maybe they still, it would still be hard to just be like, okay, ChatGPT, do my job for me, and then like there would still be a lot of filling in the gaps you'd have to do. And so the question, I think, is, what's going to happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now is really hard to answer. I know that there was a lot of speculation in, the 1970s, 80s. You have Douglas Hofstadter writing Gödel, Escher, Bach saying that, if a computer program could play chess better than a human person, then they would be equally intelligent as a human being, because chess is, so poetic and deep and thoughtful. And it turns out that's not true at all. You can write a computer program that can only play chess and do nothing else and do it better than Kasparov. But I think that what we have to be doing when we're going forward is thinking about these tools as being complements, at least in the near term, between what we're doing.
It's
Is there
Copilot
some
now.
ways, like the programmer who is using it together, this sort of human machine hybrid is going to be probably the way forward for most professions. That even if, I tend to be, again, taking the humble stance that most projections here are wrong, but I tend to take the stance that there's going to be complementarity for a lot longer than some people think. Some people think, in like 3-4 years, it's game over. They just do everything now. Whereas I tend to think, no, it's probably the case that, we're looking at maybe the useful span of our careers, there's going to be complementarity. So it's going to be something where you use it for some things, and then there's some things that you use it for, and the hybrid works better. That's at least my projection going forward, because I think human intellect and intelligence is actually very multifaceted. And so that's why I think it's going to be very hard to find a single thing that, it'll do. But I do think that that's going to be something that's going to necessitate a lot of learning, because, just as the introduction of computer digital technologies just transformed a lot of analog professions, I think we're entering the kind of the next phase of that, where we're going to be in this sort of AI powered professions, which is sort of like an additional layer of transformation of, how do I get the AI strengths and my strengths to work together well, to work together seamlessly. And so I know there's people like you who are kind of experimenting a lot with that, but I think that's going to make a big difference going forward, is the people who know how to use these tools well are going to have more career opportunities than people who either don't use it or can't use it, or what have you.
Yeah, I think the real danger is in the timeline. This idea that we zip into this. Well, how long will it be before it replaces me? I don't know that that's the cogent conversation. But you're right in the how it changes the learning. I have somewhat replaced myself only because it's made me so much better, and it forces me to think of how I'm both reinforced learning it, teaching it from its mistakes, reinforcing what I did, what it's not doing, but more importantly, it giving me access to different and opposing perspectives on the work I'm doing, which has been paramount to me feeling like I'm so much better now.
Well, now, I was going to say, just to add into that, I think right now the models are very good generalists. And so I think where you see them having an impact now is that, like, in your specialty, the thing that you are, most expert in, you have the most experience in, maybe you don't need the models so much. They're not really adding that much value. But the things where, like, I need to do this adjacent thing, but I'm not yet an expert in it, there's a lot of gap filling. So I know a lot of programmers, like, in the languages they know really well, they're not really getting the application is not helping them that much. But whenever they have to use some technology they're not so familiar with, it's really helping them fill that in. And so I think another point, which I mentioned in the book, which I think is important to keep in mind here, is that the general trend for technology, so this is not true of AI, this is true in general, is the general trend for technology is that as technologies are created, they sort of both automate some cognitive labor, but they create new opportunities for labor in their midst. So often the sort of more near-term impact is, well, this can just automatically do the thing that was being done before. So if you think about like car manufacturing, it used to be like a craft process where the manufacturers were very skilled and they're, beating the metal shape into, fitting the part exactly to that particular engine. And then that got changed in the assembly line so that you could get people who have basically no skill at all to come in there and just do a very repetitive task for, 12 hours a day. And that would be how they earn their living. But in the long term, these technologies, well, once you sort of take that mind share away, you have all these other opportunities. You can make cars that are more complicated. You can make standardized parts. You can make them more customized. So the possibilities for auto manufacturing expanded. And so I think similarly with a lot of our jobs, the sort of existing cognitive work, the existing training and stuff required, it does prevent, like it, even if you replace some of that, there's now going to be this new vista that we can expand into, that we can learn into, that will create opportunities that aren't available, before this technology is coming about. So I do think there is going to be a world of opportunities for learning in the future with results from these technologies.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I'm less on that sphere. I think that we might be faced with the first thing that can both automate and augment / replace at the same time. And it's going to force a different type of thinking, because inevitably it's going to eat its own tail and it will be doing its own work around that. I see that already, how it's happening. And, going back to what you said earlier too, I think the reason people see it as a good generalist is because the inputs are usually quite bad. I used to be in the search engine business before Google, and I sat and watched people type in the word car and expect a good result. And that's where I feel that generative AI, in particular around text, is at, because I know that I'm using it much more from the specialist perspective, and the depth it's giving me is not something I can find or use elsewhere. From it understanding previous iterations of my tone to even, I jokingly call it the evil Mitch version, which is like, I want it to give me the opposing media perspective on it, thinking like Mitch Joel, and it does it really, really effectively at depth. So maybe not on the programming front, I can see what you mean, but just its access to information, knowledge, other perspectives, it does it. It's quite well. Like I find myself always nodding along with experts like yourself, but at the same time having a very different perspective because of the work I'm doing with it, that negates a lot of this, only because I feel like the work I'm doing with it is the person who was back in the late 90s doing multi-word searches and not getting a search result versus doing a word for cars or sex and getting multiple pages of results because people were gaming for it. So it's it's terrible. Yeah, well, it's terrible because of the input. It's not always just the output.
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting perspective. And I certainly wouldn't say that my perspective is universal here. I think, going back to the previous point, I think one of the things that is, the only thing that I can say for certain is how much uncertainty there is. That, like, again, you look at people who very confidently predicted X, or said, like, once a machine can do X, it will be as smart as a person in all ways. And that just has, like, repeatedly proven to be misleading, that, like, certain things, once they find the approach to doing it, it turns out that it's trivial. Like, you could do it really easily. And so I think we all see what LLMs are doing now, but the technology is not stagnant. So I think that's really the question mark. I think if we could just have a freeze and just have large language models, like GTB4 is the last thing that comes out, or 4.0 or whatever is the last thing that comes out, and we have like 30 years to sort it out, I do think there would still be a lot of unfolding in the marketplace of, like, people figuring out how these technologies could be useful in the world of work. I mean, one of the stats that I think is really interesting is, like, when I think it was the invention of like sort of modern, I want to say it was power systems that were introduced, it took a long time for factories to change, because their whole design of a factory was based on having a single motor that would, like, operate every single machine. And so I think things take time to have this unfolding. Now, the question is just, like, are we expecting, okay, 3-4 years from now, these AI agents are just super intelligence, or are we expecting, chat GPT-4 +++, which is like, incrementally, but not transformatively getting better. And I think that's just the area that is so hard to predict.
And you're illustrating my challenge back, which is always we fall into timelines, like when. And my whole thing is, forget the when, because if you're spending time in it now, you can see that it's very clear how impressive it is at this stage, which becomes the catalyst. I want to go back though and talk a bit more about education, because another thing I kept realizing as I was reading Get Better at Anything is something that I have in my brain. And it's in my brain from when I was very young, grade 9 or 10, that I'm bad at math. I'm bad at math, Scott. I'm not good at math. Grade 10 didn't do well. Grade 11, they told me to put my head down during math class and let everyone else take math class.
Oh my God.
And I think about it all the time with my kids. Sometimes I'll look to my spouse and say, I'm not good at math. Can you help with the homework? And after reading Get Better at Anything, and I don't know why, maybe it happened with Ultralearning, but it was a while ago and I just didn't click. I thought to myself, is that true? Am I bad at math? Or maybe I'm just stuck in this childlike thinking that I now believe is a story, and that story has become part of DNA. One of the things I extracted also from the book was you taking and not just learning, but choosing very difficult things. You mentioned quantum mechanics or quantum physics. I don't know what it was before. How wrong am I? How wrong might anybody be who's listening to this, who thinks I'm bad at math, I'm bad at the arts, I'm not good at creating art, I'm not good at writing English?
So there's an interesting question here, is how much of our talents, how much of our abilities, these things, like when you say you're bad at math, I mean, there's a certain objective truth to it. There's things that I'm just bad at today, right? Like I'm not a particularly good dancer, for instance. And so if we had a dance competition, I'd probably lose. And I don't think I'm being unobjective about that. So I don't know your math ability, but certainly there's people who are bad at math who are just, I give you a math test and you're not going to do very well. So you're bad at it right now. The real question is why? What's the input to that system that makes you good or bad? And I think there's kind of two models you can have. And like all things in reality, they're kind of both sort of correct, but reality is more complicated than that. But one model is that, well, it's just sort of innate ability. Like basically you have some mental hardware that lets you do math, and some people have a really good engine and some people have a really bad engine. And if you have a bad engine, you're just never going to learn math. And then the other idea is that, well, what it is that some people have maybe a little bit of an advantage. Maybe they have just some fluke in their life causes them to get interested in math, and they spend more time practicing, and they acquire more knowledge about math, and they learn more procedures and facts and ideas. And so they have this rich substrate of knowledge about math. So when they encounter anything new, they acquire it faster because they already know some of it, and anything new neatly fits into what they already know. And they have this confidence and belief in themselves, this motivational aspect, so that when they encounter hard problems in math, they don't think to themselves, oh, well, this is proof that I'm not good at math, I should just give up. They say to themselves, oh, I love math challenges, I'm going to work on this for 2 weeks. And the reality is complicated. It is probably a mixture of both of those things, but I tend to think that the second picture gets a little bit less press. It's a little bit underrated in some ways, because background knowledge, all of these sort of skills and experiences that we bring to the table of things, are not only invisible when we see them in other people, but they're also often invisible when we see them in ourselves. So I'll give a little example. So this is like my favorite story to give of this. I knew a woman, and she got a master's in engineering, specializing in like fluid dynamics. So this is all differential equations, and
the simple stuff.
It's real easy stuff, right? And we're just having this conversation. I know that she has this background. She's like, a higher up manager at a kind of consultancy that works with like hydroelectric dams and stuff. And I was talking to her, and she was like, oh yeah, but like when I went to college, I did an intro computer programming class, and I couldn't do it. It was too hard for me. And I just sort of was taken aback a little bit, because I've done, not to her extent, but I've done some of the physics classes that she would have had to done. I've done some of the programming classes. It's my personal opinion that the physics classes are just objectively harder than the programming classes. So I was thinking about it a little bit of like, why would she form this impression of herself? Why would she have this belief that, she could get a master's in, advanced engineering and like physics and stuff, but she couldn't do an intro computer programming class in like first year university? And my theory of it is, well, who takes intro computer programming classes? Well, it's a lot of people who want to be programmers. Who wants to be programmers? Well, probably the nerdy kinds of kids that did programming in high school and maybe learned a little bit on the side. And they show up to the class and they already have all this knowledge about programming. And so when the professor hands them an assignment, well, they already kind of know how to do it. So they breeze through it. It's not hard for this person. Whereas you're encountering it for the first time, you don't understand any of these concepts. It's difficult for them to get into your head and you're struggling. And the class pace is set at the average student. So if the average student has all this background knowledge, they're racing ahead of you and you're struggling on these assignments. And what do you infer from that experience? Well, you infer from this experience that I must not be good at computer programming. And this person is not like a unique case. I have met and interacted with many people who are clearly brilliant by any kind of like raw mental horsepower spectrum, who say with a straight face that, well, I tried programming and I'm not very good at it. And I think this is just such a like fundamental misconception they're having in their head. And so I think that this is more pervasive than we take credit for, that differences in prior experience, background knowledge, skills can make an enormous difference in how quickly we acquire new skills, how quickly we acquire new information, and our, confidence, motivation levels. Now, does that mean that you have to go back and like build up that foundation for math? I don't know. Maybe math isn't so important for what you're doing in your day-to-day life. There's nothing wrong with being like, I'm not particularly good at dancing, but I'm not really that keen on becoming an excellent dancer. But I think it's useful to keep in mind that, yes, but if I got really interested in it and I invested in a project and I worked on those basics, worked on those foundations, built up from the bottom, I probably could become much better than I am right now. And so it's the possibility that I want to encourage, not necessarily that you have to take on every single project and learn every single thing and, accept every single weakness and just sort of, I'm going to improve upon them. But that there's a possibility for doing that, I think is underrated by most people.
I feel like there might be something bigger at play here, Scott, because if, let's say, we did challenge this idea, Scott challenges Mitch, spend 6 months doing high school math. Let's see where you're at. And let's say I do significantly better than I think, which I actually believe inherently I probably would. Have to do probably a sample of maturity, headspace, what you want to be when you're young. The running joke is if we wanted people to be pirates and rock stars, if we really, followed all that train down all the way down the road, that would probably unlock a lot of psychological limitations we put on ourselves. That if you could disprove a long-standing belief of yourself, something like that, which is actually quite easy to disprove, there would probably be a magnitude of new learnings and just new feelings about your potential and opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's lots of benefits to doing these kinds of projects in both directions, both with the things that you feel you're weak at and also for the things that you're really interested in already. To me, one of the big sort of catch-22s of a lot of this learning is that the things that we get reward from in our environment, and I don't mean just monetary reward, I mean social acclaim, people saying, wow, you're really good at that, you're talented, all these kind of things, they're these self-reinforcing feedback loops. So I think probably the biggest hurdle isn't even cognitive. It isn't even just that, well, maybe you need to know more math to learn math at a faster rate. It's just when you have not encountered a subject and gotten positive reinforcement early on, often the interest isn't there, the motivation isn't there. So again, I think when I'm advocating for people to take on these kind of projects, I usually ask them to start with like, what are the things you're already interested in? Because I think sometimes when you can convince yourself to learn something that you are interested in and you make a lot of progress, that tends to bleed out more into other areas. It improves this sort of general self-efficacy of like, oh, I can take on a learning project and do it. And that might give you this sort of, okay, you know what? This has been hard for me in the past, but you know what? I'm going to do it. So I think it depends on where you're at. If you're the kind of person, maybe you are already there where you've taken on a lot of challenging projects, you've learned a lot of things, and you're like, you know what? It's time to prove to myself that actually I'm not bad at math. I can learn math and do well at it. But if you're not there yet, if you're still sort of feeling like, you know what, I'm not even sure I can do the things that I do really want to do well, then I would start with those. So that's usually my recommendation to people is build on the things that you're already excited about and then use that excitement, that self-confidence to bleed out into other areas that maybe you should work on or maybe would be good for you, but you're not as excited naturally to right now.
Without any spoiler alerts, the 3 factors that you talk about and get better at anything is to see, watching others do it, do, practice, well, practice in a certain way. We'll get to that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then the feedback, which it might sound simplistic, but really what we're looking at, I think, is a model of what has been known more historically of the apprentice model. The idea that if you're in the right environment, you're watching that métier, that excellence of work happen, you're able to do it with proper skills because the people that are there understand it. I used to do a lot of really intense, I wouldn't even call it martial arts. It was like close quarter combatives. And my coach would say, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And you are working on that type of ways in which, once you get the biomechanics of how to throw a punch, the world changes for you. It's really like it's that type of thing. And then feedback, which again speaks into the type of stuff I was doing. You'll hear people like Joe Rogan and others talking about the power of studying jujitsu, because I think actually the work of what jujitsu offers is almost the exact perfect bellwether example for what you're saying, which is you're going to go in, you're going to constantly be seeing others, you're going to be doing it and learning these techniques, and the feedback is instantaneous. You're either getting it right or you're not. And it's this continuous experience of the more time on the mat, the more time you're in there, the more time you're talking about it, thinking about others. Chess would be another example of this. You do this. So not necessarily this breakthrough, we've never heard anybody talk about this, but I think what you're trying to do is bring back the ways in which we professionally would really learn and excel. Is that a fair way to look at this?
Yeah. I mean, the way I view the see-do feedback idea, which is how I organize the book, is that this is a sort of very high-level mental model of what's involved in learning. That seeing, I'm not even just meaning like literally watching someone do something, but kind of the way that we learn observationally, the way that we learn from other people. So that includes things like reading books and taking theory classes and all this kind of stuff. And do is sort of just generally the practice component. And feedback includes not just the teacher telling you what you did wrong, but the feedback from the environment and the success and failure rate and all this kind of thing. And so in some ways, as you said, these ideas are not going to be surprising. They're not going to be radical. But I use them as a starting point for digging a lot deeper into a lot of the specifics of them, because it's the way we learn observationally. Like, what are the constraints on that process that matter? So I talk about, how problem solving works and why we need to learn observationally. I talk about cognitive load theory and how that forms a bottleneck on learning from doing, and also, in how we learn observationally, the importance of worked examples. Talk about the motivational aspect and how we build confidence, like we were just talking about. I talk about the difficulty of learning from experts, because as you practice a skill repeatedly, it becomes more obvious, more automatic for you. It's harder to articulate. And so really for me, these sort of high level ideas were a way of delving into the details, because I do think when you are getting something right, the details are where it matters. It's going to matter exactly how you're learning. If we're talking about jujitsu, watch people practice and get feedback is not going to be groundbreaking, but it's going to be ideas like, well, how important is it to mix up what things you're practicing in a practice session? What kind of feedback's important when you're on your job? Like, is this kind of feedback enough to improve these results? I think there are answers to these questions. There's a lot of interesting ideas from the psychological research that, as we talked about before, like, these things are not taught in school. These things are not widely available. But if you have that handbook, if you have that kind of mental models of how learning works at this detailed level, you can construct better ways to learn, better ways to practice, better ways to get better.
I want to submit a concept to you, and feel free to strike it down.
All right.
The X factor in this would be somebody who's willing to do this, someone who's willing to teach, someone who's willing to coach. One of the concepts we've been talking a lot about on the show with other thought leaders is what makes it interesting to return to office. It's when your leaders are excellent coaches. You will show up for a great coach every single day, because you wouldn't want to work from home if you're missing a day where you might be really feeling that inspiration from that individual, from that coach. We tend to talk about the model as you're describing it, somewhere around the idea of ageism, or can we take these retired experts and bring them back to coach? Like, you hear a lot of these types of models, but really the way it's only going to work is if you have people at that current workplace who not only excel at it, can teach, which is very, very different,
Yeah.
but also want to do that in a world of
Yeah.
short-termism, in a world of quarterly results, in a world of people getting slashed by the multiples on an Excel sheet without any real cognition of what their work was or what their potential is. It challenges the system a little bit, that you're going to have people who are not just doing the job, but willing to work with people who aren't that great at it to get them there. It's a big ask.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. One of the things that drove me to write this book was sort of recognizing the interpersonal aspect, recognizing again this how much of what we know comes from other people, and the sort of the obstacles to that, like you're mentioning, that like, to learn from another expert, it's this sort of fraught social process because this person is busy, they have a resource, they have their time. Why should they give it to you, right? Why should they give access to it? I mean, we have teachers, we have, workplace seminars and professional training. So I don't want to say that, this kind of learning is absent. And indeed, it's ubiquitous, but it's the problems of getting this access that are difficult. I mean, one of the big transitions that happened during the pandemic was this shift to remote work. And I don't remember the study offhand, but one of the findings was that experienced people, experienced professionals handled the remote work transition pretty well. Like they were doing the same job they were doing before, they're doing it from home, they have more flexibility, great. The people who suffered were the people entering the workforce who were just starting out, because that sitting at the desk and being like, oh, hey, how do you do this? That is a key part of the informal learning that takes place in most workplaces. And it's a lot harder when you have to book a Zoom call with someone and they're busy and they don't have time to talk about your projects. So you're just sitting there for 6 hours being like, I don't really know how to do this right now. And so I think there's probably a lot of ways that we could accelerate or facilitate this organizational learning. I mean, from the very basic level of like when people learn how to do specific things and solve specific problems in your organization, is that just in their head or is someone documenting it? This is like a really trivial example, but I have a friend who was talking about how the way they handle their customer service department is whenever anyone would encounter a case that is not documented. So it was not something like something has come up and it's not come up before, then they would be required to record their screen of them solving the problem and then put it in the repository. And this was not considered like, going above and beyond. This was a part of your job duty, was to fill in these gaps, because even for something, relatively simple, a small company doing customer service, there could be just hundreds and hundreds of different cases that all have sort of different ways of solving it, that you might have to do a lot of problem solving to be like, oh, well, this problem had this error with their account and we found out it was because of this. But how often do those kinds of one-off situations happen in your organization, and maybe not at a customer service level, but at a higher level, where you solve it and you remember how to solve it, and maybe you tell the person who's sitting next to you, but that's it. It doesn't exist in any durable form. So that's one way, the way you can make knowledge externalized and durable and existing. I mean, this has been the triumph of our civilization. The reason that we're not where we were 10,000 years ago is because we invented culture, we invented writing, we invented systems for preserving what is known. And that's something that's often missing in organizations.
Yeah. I mean, that to me felt like the X factor.
Yeah.
That the ones who would be able to really have a circular experience with this, I'm learning, I'm growing, I'm going to keep doing that, would be in a system by which you have others who are a bit further ahead who have done it as well.
Yeah.
And that it creates that type of flow or energy, the flywheel effect for this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can see this in really successful organizations. One of the stories that I did a lot of research on, which it didn't actually end up making into the book, was looking at Bell Labs. Now, Bell Labs, of course, it still kind of exists in this sort of anemic form of its former self. But when AT&T was this sort of telephone monopoly, they had all this spare capacity and they made one of the best research laboratories in the world. I mean, this is where transistors came from, solar panels, so many inventions came from Bell Labs. And part of it was that they recruited the best people. So they had, one of the jokes was that, well, if you wanted to ask a question about some technology, you could usually just walk down the hall and find the person who won the Nobel Prize for inventing it. Right. So you had just sort of elite level people, not just sort of, run of the mill engineers, but people who could have been at the peaks of academia or at the peaks of whatever frontier they were at. People who are winning Nobel Prizes, but they happen to work at Bell Labs. But there was also this, corporate culture that really encourages diffusion of innovation, this diffusion of knowledge. Like one of the rules was, if someone needed help with something and you were like a higher up, you were like the expert, you weren't allowed to say no. So there was this real obligation of like, if you are the expert on, how do you dope silicon transistors, you would have to explain that to the people who are working on some project that was relevant for that. And so, I mean, how do you create these environments? I think they do depend on a lot of idiosyncratic factors that are hard to get right. But I think creating a learning culture, a culture where people are able to disseminate knowledge, share it freely. I mean, I think these things are so important. And like you allude to, that I think they're part of the reason why certain companies can really innovate and really dominate in this direction, is because of this ability for knowledge to diffuse within the organization.
I want to be respectful of the time. Do you have time for us to keep going a bit more?
Sure. Yeah. Let's keep going. Yeah.
So another area that I wouldn't expect you to know about my life, but I have another podcast where I interview bass players, and I've been doing that for over a decade, and it's a lot of fun. I spent a lot of time in the music industry prior to this, and you cover this topic in your book, and I thought it was so fascinating, the relationship between jazz musicians and improv. I'd have this conversation with actual masters of instruments of how are you improving in a world where you might have the actual composition, or that the song is going to go intro, verse, chorus, verse 2, bridge, however it might go. And it's really fascinating to hear a musician speak verbally using words about when improv works and how it doesn't. You make some pretty interesting connections. Tell me a bit about what's going on with jazz musicians and improv and learning, because it really resonated with me.
Well, I highly recommend, if you're interested in this, reading the book that was one of the main source materials for the jazz component, was the book by Paul Berliner, Thinking in Jazz. So it's an ethnology of various jazz musicians, and the author is also a jazz musician. So it's not just written by some outsider, but he interviews all of these great jazz musicians and really looks into how do they perform, how do they train, what is their sort of experience, like how are they able to do what they're able to do. And one of the big takeaways I had from this, well, there's a couple, but one of the big ones is how knowledge intensive improvisation is. So we tend to think of creativity, spontaneity, this fluidity as being a process that emerges from nowhere, right? Like it's the muse, it's the ether. But really, it's having all these patterns, this big library of jazz. I think I forget who it was. It was one jazz singer. I want to say maybe Carmen Lundy. She says in that I quote in the book, she says that, at the beginning she could recognize jazz licks, and then she could recognize bebop licks, and then it was like, oh, this is a Charlie Parker lick or a Sonny Rollins lick. So basically, as your repertoire increases, you get this sort of rich knowledge of like, this is what's been played and this is what someone else has played and how they like to play it. And so creativity is coming from the kind of combinatorial possibilities that have a not large knowledge base. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is how you practice, because you can certainly practice in a way like a classical pianist would just play some difficult piece over and over and over again until they can do it perfectly. And there's a skill involved in doing that, undoubtedly. But that's different from improvisation. It's different from the ability to flexibly change what you're doing, make something up on the fly. And so I think one of the key components to getting that improvisational ability is variability in practice. So as a classic example, if you are learning tennis, for instance, you could just focus on your backhand, or it could be backhand, forehand, different kinds of shots, and you mix them together. And what research shows about this is that the more that you mix together different types of practice components, the better you are able to sort of decide which one to use in a particular moment, the better you're able to generalize them to new situations. And so this is just one example of ways you can increase variability in your practice to have more improvisational skill as opposed to just repetitive skill, or the ability to do something perfectly but always in the same way.
Yeah, the black belt version of that is Mr. Miyagi wax on, wax off, which is you're using the techniques for something else, and it's drawing a new form of how to think about it, which is like the master way to do that, which I love so much. The other component of it that I was thinking about with learning is how much of it then becomes perspiration versus aptitude. So we could say this is similar to a nature versus nurture. I think it's a little bit different. There's a
Yeah.
lot of people who would prescribe to this idea that there's very few vocations in particular that if you just don't put in the actual perspiration, it's not going to happen. It will come if you simply
Yeah.
do it. And then there are others who would say, no, this requires a certain level of aptitude. When it comes to work, it feels to me, especially when we speak to entrepreneurs, I love the podcast Founders as well. They talk about this a
Yeah.
lot, that it really is just a form of perspiration. You're putting on the work pants and going for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because when we're thinking about contributions for things, so again, like the more classic one is genetics or environment. Like there's been lots of study on that, and I think part of the difficulty in saying, oh, it's this trait is 80% genetic or this trait is 50% genetic. Excuse me. This trait is 80% genetic or this trait is 50% genetic. Part of the problem is that it depends on what you're looking at. It's not a static kind of number you can just pick out. So to use the point I would give, if you're looking at an elite in a profession, so if you're looking at sort of the very tippy top of some performance domain, so the best sprinters or the best golfers or the best CEOs, these are going to be domains that just by their very nature, people who are at the top are probably working near 100%. Like everyone is working about as hard as they can. So there is this range restriction problem where if you're saying, well, how important is it to work hard if you're a CEO or if you're an elite tennis player? Well, I think from individual point of view, they will say to themselves, well, it's very important. Like everyone is working insanely hard. But because everyone is working very hard, there can't be much variation in how hard people work. And therefore, that variation can't explain very much of the variation in performance. So sort of paradoxically, in the situation where every single person works really hard, it's easy to stand back from the outside and to be like, well, actually, it's all genetic. Like the only thing that matters of whether you're going to be a sprinter is Usain Bolt being genetic. But of course, for each individual person, they have to work very hard because if they worked even 99% as hard as they could work, then they're immediately cut out of the race because of how important that is. So if we're acting about the middle spectrum, the sort of areas where you want to be modestly successful, and you want to you want to have a good job, you want to have a good career doing something, you want to be decent at a hobby, you want to be a decent golf player. I tend to think that it's often the reverse, that the perspiration, as you say, explains much more of the variation simply because there's such a range in how hard people are trying at things. And so it is kind of the maxim that like, yeah, you can actually try harder than most people, and that can easily make up for, sort of superficial or small differences in aptitude. Now, the confounder here, of course, is that people who have more aptitude for the motivational reasons you described tend to also be the people who work harder. So that also distorts it further because you have situations where like the person who is naturally a little bit better at math works harder at math because they get a little bit more reward from the environment, and so they're more motivated. But I mean, if you're just asking me, okay, Mitch is going to just suddenly now work really hard at math, I think that, yeah, you could be better at math than like 98% of people just because most people aren't trying very hard to be good at math. You know what I mean? And so I think that's one of the things that's hard to answer these questions, is that really they interact in these in unusual ways.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about some of the externalities, which luck would be another one. You could have people that are putting in the same input output, but there's just some luck there, that there's no meritocracy.
And what do we mean by luck too? This is another thing that drives me crazy, is that luck is this kind of like catch-all term. But, Usain Bolt is probably very lucky in terms of having this like, really high quantity of fast twitch muscle fibers and, being really athletic, that he can run very quickly. I mean, there was even some studies showing that when world record holders set their world records, they usually have the wind is blowing at their back.
I was going to say weather would be what I see as luck.
It is just a pure luck factor. But at the same time, I think there is sometimes this idea that like, well, it's just random. It's just impossible to predict who's going to be successful. No. And I would say, informally in my own kind of career, looking at people, it's often pretty obvious who's going to be successful before they're really successful. Like, just because, oh, this person is clearly smart, they're clearly working hard, they're clearly doing the right things. They're not successful yet, but they're going to be successful, which belies that, like, that level of predictive accuracy belies the idea that, well, it's just randomness. Like, anyone could be successful. It's like buying lottery tickets. I think that's probably not true. It's, it's usually the case that the people who are conscientious, hardworking, clever, this kind of thing, they tend to win out in the long run by, even if any individual project has some uncertainty associated with it. So I don't know. Again, it's complicated. It's very difficult to say these answers affirmatively, but I think people like a simple picture where it's all this or all that. But really, it's very complicated, and it's one thing where, raising your persistence level, raising your perspiration, raising your strategy for doing these things can have large effects, especially in the middle zone that we mostly operate in.
You teased out a little bit about it. It's an area that I go crazy about.
Yeah.
And it's the one thing people ask me, what is it, Mitch? Like, what has helped you? It's the same answer. It's books.
Yeah.
I love reading books.
Yeah.
I read books all the time. I buy books all the time. Never going to read all the books that I buy. Books,
Yeah.
books. My kids will often say to me something like, but you're always on your phone, and I'm quick to turn around. It's the Kindle app. I'm like, books.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And being a very digital person,
Yeah.
this is a very interesting technology to talk about. How is it that in all of the iterations of technology, media, print, digital, beyond, this still is such a great tool for us to transfer information? What is going on with it? Have you thought about that?
Well, I mean, I like text in all its formats. And so, I gain a lot of value on certain topics from reading Wikipedia, and I gain value from reading blogs and listening to podcasts. And so I don't want to be overly prejudiced in favor of books, but I do think books have a few things in their favor. So the first thing, if anyone, if you've ever written a book, that it's this long process with a lot of sort of, especially if you go through a traditional publishing channel. It's changed a little bit with the advent of self-publishing, but if you go through a traditional publishing channel, there's a lot of little gatekeeping checks. It's a long, drawn-out process, and there really is an expectation of a certain amount of intellectual input. So even in this business book genre, which is not the most, the genre of books I'm writing in are not generally like the most well-researched books, the most deeply written books, deeply thought out books. But even in that genre, you expect a smart person probably thought about this idea for a couple years at least before they wrote about it. And so that's kind of like the minimum threshold. Obviously, if you get into textbooks or academic books or books where, this has been this person's entire life that have gone into this book, you could go much longer than that. You can read books where this has been the idea or the thesis that this person has been building toward for 20 years. So in some sense, the sort of real magic of books is that you get to benefit from the end product of what someone spent multiple decades, a smart person spent multiple decades thinking through. And so I think that has a lot of returns on it, just that concentration of intellectual force that's been applied to a problem.
I love that. Scott, tell me the one thing that made you Scott, tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
I think the thing that made me think differently in writing this book was encountering the work of John Sweller, who was really making clear to me the importance of examples and learning from other people. So even after doing all these projects, even after spending, decades learning about learning, I think this idea was something that I don't think I really fully appreciated, really sunk into my bones the way it has now. And so that was a big reason that I made it front and center of this book, is that, how important it is to learn from other people.
I love it. So Scott, the new book is called Get Better at Anything. The other book is called Ultralearning. You're also doing something really interesting with Cal Newport, who's another thought leader and work that I love, admire, and follow, called Life of Focus. Let people know where they can find out more about all of this stuff, the books. You write a ton, you do a podcast of your own.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the best way to find out what is my website, scotthyoung.com. There's lots of resources there. There's links to the books. There's links to the course that we have with Cal, Life of Focus. And I just recommend checking it out. If you're interested in the books, they're also available on Amazon, Audible, wherever you get your books from.
Scott, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.